Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to uncover the silent economic engine that literally drives international friction, historical crises, and honestly, our current fragile reality. You hear about trade tariffs, currency wars, and geopolitical tensions all the time on the news, right? Well, the root cause of all of that is often hidden completely in plain sight.
Now, you might be wondering, why should I care about global imbalances? I mean, it sounds like really boring accounting. Just a bunch of ledgers, imports, and exports. But stay with me here because understanding this, it gives you the absolute skeleton key to understanding world history and today's shifting power dynamics.
Just listen to how the renowned economic commentator Martin Wolf puts it. He elevates this dry concept right to the absolute center of global survival. He says they lie at the intersection of almost everything that matters in global economics and politics: national power, full employment, industrial strength, financial stability. Seriously, if you want to know who really holds the cards in global politics, you can't just look at the military. You've got to look at the balance of payments.
So, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to break this down step by step, starting with the neo-mercantilist age, then defining global imbalances, looking at the echoes of the 1920s, uncovering the surplus deficit trap, and wrapping up with today's fragile balancing act.
All right, part 1. The neo-mercantilist age.
To actually understand today, we have to do a quick rewind to the 17th and 18th centuries. This was the era of mercantilism. Back then, trade surpluses were viewed as the ultimate measure of national strength. If your country exported way more than it imported, basically hoarding gold like a dragon, you were winning. But here's the catch. This intense historical obsession with trade surpluses went hand in hand with constant warfare. It was completely viewed as a zero-sum game.
Fast forward to right now, and we're seeing a massive resurgence of this exact mindset. External balances are, once again, a huge source of friction between major nations. Think about when the presidents of the US and China meet. The tension there isn't just about political ideology, it's deeply rooted in massive trade imbalances. We're essentially living in a neo-mercantilist age where the international ledger is a modern-day battlefield.
Moving on to part 2, defining global imbalances.
I want you to imagine a giant global seesaw, okay? On one side, we have the surplus countries, nations like China, Germany, and Japan. They produce far more than they consume, banking all that excess. Then, on the other side, you have the deficit countries, primarily the US and the UK. They consume way more than they produce, and they borrow to make up the difference. At first glance, it looks like a peaceful exchange, right? Goods for debt. But as we're going to see, this seesaw is dangerously off balance.
Which brings us to part 3, echoes of the 1920s. Look at how this exact sequence of economic fragility triggered a terrifying domino effect back in the 1920s and 30s. After World War I, the US became the dominant creditor. In 1925, the UK returns to the gold standard, which causes severe deflation. So to help ease that pressure, the US Federal Reserve eases monetary policy in 1927. And what happens? This inflates a massive financial bubble in the US. In 1929, the market crashes. By 1930, protective tariffs like Smoot-Hawley basically shut down global trade. And by 1933, amidst a devastating Great Depression, Adolf Hitler emerges as Chancellor of Germany. It's a terrifying chain reaction driven entirely by an inability to manage global economic imbalances.
And you know what the scariest part is? These clashes over external balances aren't just a relic of the past. They recur roughly every 2 decades. The absolute chaos of the 20s and 30s ended in World War II, which then forced the creation of Bretton Woods and the IMF in 1944 specifically to manage these exact imbalances. But the pressure always builds back up. The system fractured again in the 1960s with the collapse of fixed exchange rates, and we saw severe clashes yet again in the 1980s.
Let's dive into part 4, the surplus deficit trap.
You see, surplus countries aren't entirely in control here. They frequently fall into a devastating, predictable cycle themselves. Step 1, because they export so much, they face immense external and internal pressure to expand domestic demand, mostly to ease the deflationary pressure on their trading partners. Step 2, because their economies are completely hardwired for exports, pumping money domestically usually bypasses the actual consumers and just inflates an unsustainable property bubble. And step 3, that bubble eventually bursts. We literally saw this exact trap spring on Japan in the 1980s, and we saw it happen to China after the 2007 to 2009 global financial crisis.
Germany found itself in a very similar trap during the Eurozone crisis, but they managed it a bit differently because they're locked within a monetary union. Instead of letting the euro splinter apart, Germany basically chose to finance the crisis-hit countries that were buying its goods. As a result, the German Bundesbank became a giant creditor via what are called target balances. Honestly, it's like a store lending money to its own customers just so they can keep buying items off the shelves. They had to do it to keep the whole economic system breathing.
So, it turns out to be this deeply symbiotic trap. Surplus countries are basically addicted to producing excess tradable goods. Now, moralists in those surplus countries might complain endlessly about the debt and profligacy of the deficit countries, but here is the cold, hard reality. They desperately need those deficit countries to keep buying. Without them, the surplus countries would face a massive, immediate economic slump.
Finally, Part 5, a fragile balancing act. This dynamic perfectly explains why emerging markets fail as the world's balancers, leaving the U.S. as the predominant consumer of last resort. When emerging markets borrow heavily to consume, they mostly have to do it in foreign currencies. So when a crisis hits, their central banks can't just print those foreign currencies to pay the debt. They collapse and they need an IMF rescue. But the US and the UK? They can borrow freely in their own currencies. That unique privilege has made them the dominant deficit balancers, completely offsetting the world's massive surpluses.
But holding up the global economy comes at a really severe domestic price. Deficit countries suffer intense vulnerabilities. They experience a massive expansion in domestic indebtedness. For everyday people, that means skyrocketing personal debt and a much higher cost of living. And because they import so much, their own production of tradable goods and services weakens. Domestic industries hollow out, factories close down. Naturally, this economic hollowing out creates explosive political problems right at home.
And that brings us right to current events. Whether we're looking at former President Trump's aggressive tariffs or Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's efforts to sustain global demand for U.S. bonds, we have to look at these objectively as direct symptoms of these deficit difficulties. The intense political pressure from a weakened industrial base and a skyrocketing national debt inevitably forces a reaction. These aren't just isolated political choices, they are the structural consequences of being the world's consumer.
Which leads us to a super sobering warning from John Maynard Keynes. None of these challenges will be managed automatically by markets. Financial markets are just way too fragile, and the domestic political stakes are far too high to simply trust that the invisible hand will magically work things out. We really cannot rely on unregulated markets to fix a structural geopolitical flaw of this magnitude. So, I want to leave you with this final, vital question to ponder. If the era of pure liberal capitalism and unchecked free trade is over, what will replace it that doesn't blow up the world economy? We are currently on a totally unsustainable path, relying almost entirely on the US and UK to balance the global ledger. Eventually, this dynamic will and must change. But how? That is the question we all need to be focused on. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep your eyes on those balance sheets, and I'll catch you next time.